London, February 1787. Tom was chained with the others sentenced in court that day, the metal collar around his neck again. The chafing at his wrists and ankles to prevent escape, and loaded onto one of the 3 open wagons waiting in the prison forecourt. Each wagon had 2 guards and a driver, as well as its load of prisoners, men in 2 of the wagons and women in the other. Tom peered around the body of the man next to him. They were all much older than him, though none was really old. "Where are we going?" he asked the man next to him. The man ignored him, sunk in his own troubles, but one of the others answered, "Hulks on the Thames, I reckon, if they don't rot afore we gets there." "Quite in the back there." It was the driver. Then he added, "None of yous for the hulks. It's going down to Plymouth you are. There's a fleet that sets to sail." "Where to?" asked someone. For a moment Tom thought the driver wouldn't answer. Then he said, "That new place. What's its name again?" "Botany Bay," said one of the guards, as the driver jiggled the reins and the horses began to move. The guard laughed shortly. "Down at the end o' the world, that is. You're bound for the end of the world." The wagon rumbled through the night, and the next day and night too, stopping only for the horses to be changed and for the prisoners to be given a mug of water and a small loaf each. The guards took turns snoozing up front and complained when it rained. It was cold, but Tom was used to cold. He was hungry and often thirsty, but he was used to that as well. But now he had fresh air to smell, the scent of soil and grass. He could see the trees and fields, even if the trees were still leafless. There were villages to look at, and stone walls and cottage windows to stare into as the horses plodded past, where families sat at tables or watched the fire, all echoes of the life that he'd once known. The beauty about him cut Tom like a knife. "I'm leaving all this behind," he thought. "I'm going to the end of the world." What would the end of the world be like? Ice, maybe, or desert? Tom asked, but no one knew. Men worked in the fields as they passed. It was hard to think now that he had once looked down on such men without a trade. Tom would give anything to stand behind a horse and plough, or to dig ditches in the quiet air. The men stared at their chains as they passed. "They know we are prisoners," thought Tom. "We're the scum no one wants." It was midday when they reached Plymouth, after 3 days and 3 nights in the cart, though the tang of the sea had been in their nostrils for 2 hours or more. The cart clattered on the cobbles down to the harbour side. Tom gazed out across the water. Ships bobbed on the waves, looking impossibly small. Which of these am I destined for? Tom wondered. He shivered, only partly from cold. At least in the cart, with the gentle English smells about him, he could dream he was free. There'd be no dreams like that in the dark hold of a ship. "Whoa there!" The driver pulled on the reins. The cart creaked to a stop. "Everybody out! Look lively and no funny business." Tom stumbled from the cart. The chains had chafed his neck and ankles, leaving sores that bled if he moved too much. His legs were cramped and stiff from cold. One by one the prisoners marched along the quay, then down the narrow slimy steps and into a small boat, with 2 guards at the oars and another at the tiller. The boat pulled away from the quay. Suddenly Tom knew with dreadful clarity that he'd never set foot again on English ground. The growing distance between himself and the land was just the start of their permanent separation. They were passing the first of the ships now. Tom craned to see each one as they passed, frighteningly small vessels to carry them across the world. One was called the Friendship, and he felt a pang of grief, remembering Jem. He half hoped this shift would be his destination, but the guards rowed past it to the Scarborough instead. The rowing boat bumped against the side of the Scarborough near a dark rope ladder hanging down over the side of the ship. The convicts climbed the ladder one by one. Tom gripped the wet rope and hauled himself upwards. The ladder swung with every step, and the weight of the chains made the swinging worse. If the man in front or behind fell, he'd be drowned too, thought Tom, dragged down into the waves by the weight of iron, but no one fell. It felt strange to stand on the rocking deck. A guard unlocked each of their chains in turn. Tom looked at the blue and bloody bruises on his wrists and ankles where the chains had rested, then looked away. "Strip," muttered the guard. Tom stared. "I said strip, all of yous," the man ordered more loudly. Tom pulled his ragged shirt over his head, feeling the damp wind bite into his bare flesh, and then removed his tattered breeches. Now the prisoners were all naked, standing in the cold sea wind for everyone to stare at. 2 by 2 they clambered into half-barrels full of seawater and were given fatty cakes of carbolic soap to wash away the dirt and venom, while their hair was clipped close to their heads to remove the lice. Tom looked at the soapy scum on the water. "There's chimney soot in there," he thought, and Newgate stench. At least I'm free of those, no matter what comes next. Tom left the water reluctantly. At least the barrel hid his skinny, naked limbs and the dark bruises. It was even colder standing wet on the deck. There were no towels. Instead, Tom was lined up with the other convicts, all dripping, all naked and bald, and handed coarse trousers, 2 shirts, a jacket and stockings, a cap and a pair of shoes, all far better than the rags Tom had worn for the past year, and clean too. He put them on gladly, feeling their crispness and cleanliness against his skin. A clanging sound warned him. The guards hauled chains from a rusty pile on the deck, a cuff of rusty metals for each ankle, with a thick chain in between, long enough to let you walk, but not to run or move quickly. The chains were designed for a man, not a boy, but they were no worse than the chains Tom was used to. "Move!" yelled the guard. The prisoners shuffled forward again, and their chains clanging and sliding on the damp wood towards a dark hole in the deck. Tom stared at the hole. "Not down there," he thought. "It's like the chimneys. Please don't let us go down there." But, one by one, the prisoners turned to clamber down the ladder into the hole. Tom took a final breath of brisk salt air, a final look at the seagulls soaring across the blue sky. It was to be his last glimpse of the sky for months. Down, down, down. With every step his chains dangled and weighed at his ankles. Tom stared into the gloom. There were no portholes and no lanterns or candles either. It was impossible to see. Tom stepped off the ladder and onto the damp floor. The blackness was impenetrable after the bright sunlight up on deck. Beside him, the men had to bend almost double in the confined space. At least he could stand upright. It smelt of tar and sweat and privies, and it was full of people. The guard yelled down into the gloom, "Find yourselves a berth. Look lively now." He began to pull up the ladder. Tom tried to see where to go. His eyes were adjusting to the gloom now. He could just make out 2 rows of wooden slatted sleeping berths, one above each other, each about 6 feet square. A face slid out from one of the nearby berths as the hatch shut above them, cutting off the last of the light. "Four to a berth. Here, young'un, you go up with Sailor Sam. There's still space there." Tom went where he was shoved. There were no other choice in the sudden darkness. A leathery hand reached down and pulled him up onto one of the upper berths. Tom tried to sit and bumped his head on the ceiling. He slithered down onto his stomach instead. It was impossible to see his companion, but the hand had been callous. "And who do you be?" demanded a voice. It was an old man's voice, hoarse and unsteady. The breath stank like a privy. "Thomas Appleby. Tom." The hand grasped his again. "Well, Tom, welcome aboard." The throaty voice seemed genuinely friendly, despite the smell. "They call me Sam." "What is your real name, then?" asked Tom. "Sam." The old voice cackled as though it was a hilarious joke. "You got your bundle? Good lad, then. Best to tie it to your berth. No, let Sam do it for you. Sam sailed the 7 seas, man and boy. Sam will see you right on board." Which 7 seas were they? Tom couldn't care less where the old sailor had gone, but the thought of being alone in this confusion of dark and stench and noise terrified him. Talking to anyone, even an old sailor who stank of bad breath and poor digestion, was better than nothing. North Sea, Mediterranean Sea, Sargasso Sea, Caribbean Sea, Labrador Sea. Tom counted. "That's only 5 seas, he objected. The cackle came again. "There'll be 7 and more by the time we finish this journey, matey." "How long were you a sailor?" Talking kept the darkness at bay. "Weren't a sailor at all," said Sam. "They just calls me that. Goes with Sam, I reckon. Sides, I know all about the sea, more'n any of this lot here. I were a marine, I were, fought in the War of the Americas." Tom nodded in the darkness. He didn't need to ask how Sam had come from being a marine to a convict. There had been plenty like Sam in Newgate. There had been few jobs once the men had been released from the army and the navy after the war with America. Many had chosen theft instead of starvation. "Did you come from Newgate too?" Tom felt rather than saw Sam shake his head. "Most comes from the prison ships on the Thames. You'll be the one of the last boatloads to come aboard, I reckon." "Why do you think that?" "'Cause up to a week ago they had us working on the docks, moving rocks to make the breakwater or manning their hand dredge to deepen the harbour. But now they've got us locked up tighter than a rat's behind. Any tide now we're off to Botany Bay, and a good thing too." Sam spat down into the darkness. "Had enough of land, I have. Nothing good as it comes of it since I've been ashore." "Who else sleeps on this berth?" Already the soft rocking of the ship made Tom feel queasy and strangely sleepy too. "Black Bob and John the Tooth," said Sam. They be over in the corner playing dice. But it's too dark to see. Again, Tom felt rather than saw the shrug. You can feel the dice, no need to see 'em. Played dice myself in darkness many a time. That's where when we was becalmed off the Carolina coast, strange that were. Tom lay back to listen, using his bundle as a pillow. His stomach seemed easier lying down, and besides, he'd had little sleep over the last few days in the cart. He dozed off to the soft cackle of Sam's voice. Grey sky and water, the clouds just sat there, but not a drop did we have to drink. Over half the crew we lost that month alone. It was the first of hundreds of stories Tom was to hear, crammed up with Sam on the berth in the darkness. Stories of shipwrecks and mermaids and waves that were higher than 50 ships. At first Tom thought that they were lies. No man could have lived through all of them, especially Sailor Sam, who could hardly be over 50, or he wouldn't have been chosen to go to the colonies. But the years of starvation at sea, and worse in an American prison, the scurvy and the imprisonment had aged Sam. With his teeth all gone, he sounded 100 years old, and in daylight looked 70 or more. But Sam's stories kept the boredom away in the endless hours below deck, when the only air or light came through the hatch, and even that vanished in bad weather. And the stories were true, or mostly. If they hadn't happened to Sam, they had to someone he'd known. It seemed there were a lot of time for stories at sea. Some were fantastic, like the sea monster washed up on the Yankee beach, 60 feet from top to tail, but others told the boy about the world. Sam had a memory for every word he'd heard, and a gift for storytelling too, and Tom had nothing to do in the damp, smelly darkness but listen. It seemed that voyaging at sea was a dangerous matter, even if you weren't at war with the French or the Americans. Over a third of sailors died at sea, from the scurvy, starvation, thirst, dysentery, or lost limbs or eyes, and Lieutenant James Cook was the only English captain who had ventured as far as Botany Bay. Botany Bay, said Sam, in the midst of another tale. Aye, that's where we headed, afore the Frenchies beat us to it and take the land. You mark me words, we'll be at war with the Frenchies again afore too long. Sam seemed enthusiastic, even though he would not be there to see it. What's Botany Bay like? Sam scratched his head, then kept scratching as he dislodged a scab from between what was left of his hair. Aye, it's a grand place, they say. Really? Tom felt a thread of hope. Who says? The captain that went there. Oh, nigh on 20 years ago it were now. Lieutenant Cook. I sailed with Tin Hand Jim and he sailed with Cook. Tin Hand Jim, he saw it all. What did he see? Asked Tom impatiently. Are there big towns there and farms? Sam cackled. Farms? Not on your Nelly, matey. There are no farms, nor cities neither. Only black heathens, big tall Indians, naked as the day they were born, with spears and long fur coats and... You said the Indians were naked, interrupted Tom. Naked under their cloaks, boy. Don't interrupt, or I'll tell you no further. Tom grinned in the darkness. There were no chances of Sam stopping his stories. He even talked in his sleep and screamed sometimes, which was why no one else had wanted to share the berth with him. But Sam never told the stories behind his nightmares, or at least not to Tom. Strange monsters they are too, rabbits more 6 foot high that jump on their hind legs. Are you sure? Demanded Tom. Sure as sure. Didn't Tim Jim tell me it? And fish in the sea, and trees all full of fruit. We'll have a grand time there, boy, a grand time. And Sam's voice was full of hope, for himself as well as Tom. Darkness, stench and crowding, but it was better than Newgate, and better than the cellar too. At least here there were no work to tear your bones, no soot to wear in every crevice of you. The food was far better as well. 2 slices of bread for breakfast, pea soup with fresh vegetables for dinner, and even fresh meat in the soup sometimes. It had been a year since Tom had tasted fresh meat or vegetables, apart from the potatoes on Christmas Day and the meal he had shared with bald Sally. Oatmeal porridge for supper, a mug of beer once a week, and even if the bread was stale and even green, and there were weevils in the porridge, well, as Sam said, a bit of weevil did no one any harm. And at least the food was regular and even hot, and shared out proper like in pannikins, so each man got his feed. There were 2 buckets for a privy that all the prisoners shared, hauled upwards by the guard. There was an infirmary with a surgeon who inspected each of the convicts. Tom's ulcers were painted and gradually healed. The visit to the surgeon was the only time in the 3 weeks before the ship sailed that Tom was allowed up on deck. Orders forbade convicts on the deck until the ship was out of sight of land in case they mutinied, as some had done before, and sailed off with the ship. But those convicts had come to a bad end, said Sam. They'd all been taken or eaten by savages far away. Tom peered back at the shore, grey and misty now in the constant winter rain. The seagulls shrieked overhead, hoping for slops. This would be the last time he'd see England for 7 years. Forever, said a whisper in his brain. Goodbye to Pa, to Jem. You are saying goodbye to forever. Chapter 19, Muraroo, Australia, 15 April 1868. Thomas Appleby sat in his chair on the veranda, overlooking the lawn, and digested his breakfast. Stewed peaches, porridge, kidneys and bacon, some of Millie's mushrooms fried in butter by the cook, a slice of toast with marmalade from their own orange trees, 3 good strong cups of tea. It was a breakfast that a man could do some work on, but these days Thomas Appleby needed time to let it settle. Fancy thinking he'd seen a ghost this morning. Well, at his age it wouldn't be surprising if his eyes were no longer clear, thought Thomas morosely. But his eyesight wasn't as bad as that, surely. He could see the willow trees along the riverbank, where once the red gums grew. They had cut those gums for fence post. He could see the river and the hills. The land was his as far as the eye could see. In truth, the hills blocked the eye from seeing very far at all, but still, 4,000 acres was a goodly property. 4,000 acres, 5 children living, Joshua, Marcus and the girls, 27 grandchildren, 43 great-grandchildren. Give me time, Thomas thought contentedly, and I'd have filled up half of Australia. They called it Australia now, not New Holland anymore, to wipe away the shame of the country's convict past. My past too, thought Thomas Appleby, and smiled. Who alive remembered the convict boy who'd stared at the blank green face of Australia and wrapped the courage cloak around himself and swore that he'd survive? Perhaps, thought Thomas, the ghost on the lawn was me as a boy, all those years ago, come to haunt me again now. But no, the ghost hadn't worn convict garb, and besides, that boy had been transformed, and in his place sat Thomas Appleby, grazier magistrate, his convict past carefully forgotten. One of the Martha's boys was even talking of going back to England to Oxford University to study, like the gentleman he was. No, it would not be a good thing for a gentleman at Oxford to own up to an ex-convict great-grandfather. How could the scholars in their robes ever understand the way it had been for a small boy trapped in London slums? Some things were best forgotten, just as the floods swept the river clean, time swept the pain of it away. Will there ever come a day, thought Thomas, when there'll be no shame in looking back? It was an amazing thing we did back then, crossing 4 oceans in our tiny ships, to a place only one English captain had ever sailed to before, and settling an unknown land, but no one wants to remember those days now. Chapter 20, The Scarborough, May 1787. On the evening of May 12th, Captain Phillip ordered the fleet to weigh anchor and set sail for the new land. Nothing happened. The sailors were on strike. The owners of the ships hadn't paid them for 7 months, and they refused to sail until they got their money. Finally, at 3 in the morning on the next day, Tom felt the strange vibration as the wind filled the sails and the anchor was lifted. The ship was no longer rocking back and forth, tossed by the English waves. Instead, as the wind grew stronger in the grey dawn light, the ships headed out to sea. Of the 11 ships that were known as the First Fleet, 2 were naval warships, the Sirius, which also carried Captain Phillip, and the Supply. The other ships were converted merchant ships, hired by the government for the voyage. 3 store ships and 6 transports, with 736 convicts aboard. There were about 1,450 people in all, officers, surgeons, sailors, marines, and their families, as well as the convicts. Most of the convicts were aged between 20 and 35. Many were farm labourers convicted of minor theft, highway robbery, or theft of sheep or cattle. There was 1 gardener, 1 fisherman, 5 shoemakers, 2 brickmakers. There were also ivory turners, glove makers, oyster sellers and milliners, jobs for which there would be little use in Botany Bay. Most of the women had been domestic servants. There were no convicted murderers, no rapists. Tom was the second youngest of all the convicts, the doctor told him, and the youngest on their ship, and Sam one of the oldest, though there were a few still older than he. By afternoon of the first day at sea, the convicts were allowed on deck for air and exercise, lugging their chains in an endless shuffle around the deck. It was bliss to stand again in the fresh air, to stretch cramped limbs even though the tiny deck was crowded. Tom edged his way to the rail and gazed about him. No, they were not totally out of sight of land. There in the misty distance behind him were a thicker mist that held his past. Pa, Jem, Master Jack, the fields where he'd hunted mushrooms only 18 months before, the hedges where he'd picked cobnuts and chewed the bitter haws. Would there be haws or cobs in Botany Bay? Of course there would, he thought uncertainly. It was country, wasn't it? You always found cobs and haws out in the country. But there would be no chimneys at any rate, or none at least till he was too old to climb them. Whatever Botany Bay held for him, thought Tom, it wasn't chimneys. The convicts were allowed out only on the lower deck. The officers, marines, guards and their families used the upper deck. Between the two decks was a barricade about 3 feet high, armed with pointed iron prongs. Tom looked at the people on the upper deck curiously. 2 women in wide bonnets, staring back towards the vanished land, marines in their bright uniforms. And a boy his age or maybe a year older, dressed like he had been only 18 months ago. Good breeches, boots and stockings, a cap upon his head, and no chains, thought Tom. It had been so long since he had been able to move without the constant weight and chafing of his chains. The boy must have felt Tom looking. He turned and caught Tom's eye, then hurriedly turned away. "All below!" bellowed one of the guards, "and I mean now!" The horde of convicts limped obediently down the hatch once more.